renovation or new building, today's spaces and buildings are such that the architects who design them, they already know that most likely the usage of this space will even change before kind of almost that it's even taken into use. It could be totally different than the architect thought it would be. So the system needs to adapt all the time to the changing requirements and the usage of the space. And that's where the self-learning with Active Ahead comes in and is really handy. The installation may be time consuming with many. Wireless solutions have there, of course, the benefit that, as said, you don't need to run control wires. But in certain cases, even with wireless, you need to have a central point of contact, a gateway, or something that you can actually operate the system. Or you need to add a lot of configuration to make it actually work. You know what? The Active Ahead kind of operates from the day one. So when you turn on the mains, it starts to learn, it starts to operate. If you have a sensor in the luminaires, as you typically have with Active Ahead, then they run from day one. So you don't need to necessarily add anything to get them operational. And value added kind of, or value add that the lighting control typically brings. Some of the customers kind of perceive it as not being enough for the kind of payback time. So the return on that investment needs to be high enough that they actually will take it into the project. Let's say a few numbers from an example project, and this is actually our parking garage we've done in our building. It's with 340 something, if I remember correctly, Active Ahead luminaires. Today, actually, we've now half of that we've already upgraded to the second generation of Active Ahead, which we're now launching. So half of it is still with the current generation, and then half of that has been actually upgraded already. The savings, for example, for the energy would be similar in both, so you wouldn't have kind of affected these numbers here. But it's a good example. We've recorded and read from the drivers the actual energy consumption of the luminaires, and we can see that against the fluorescent lighting, there used to be, we are saving 85% of energy. And it used to be so that it was time-based, kind of schedule-based lighting control there, where the whole of the parking garage was on throughout the office hours, and then basically majority of the space was fully dark outside of the office hours and then the weekend. So a small area was lit up then during the weekend. So it was horrible in the kind of, let's say, user experience when you came in kind of outside of the office hours. And if you would have then done the same installation that we did with Active Ahead, if you would have done that with LED, so the same basically drivers and modules, same luminaires, but without the Active Ahead control there, we still actually would save 70% with this Active Ahead installation. So that is a significant number, and of course plays a big thing on the return on investment in these kind of projects. And it was, in addition to those benefits, it was super efficient to set up as such. So the parking garage was operational kind of all the time. So when the guys did the renovation, so they actually replaced one-to-one the luminaires. So they had one circuit down at the time, and they updated those luminaires or swapped those luminaires, and the parking garage was operational all the time. And this is something we've seen also that our customers are doing in certain, well, it depends a bit, of course, on the legislations and the parking garage and all the space type. But we've seen this actually be the case in real projects around Europe, for example. So it's not something that we just kind of experienced here in our parking garage, but we've seen people do this in real projects with Active Ahead. The configuration time was 1 hour with the 350 luminaires here, and that is because you don't really need to touch and configure all of the luminaires as such. You can push settings to the whole network, for example, timeouts and light levels, if they need to be changed from the default values. And then grouping, kind of basically in typical scenarios, you either group drive lanes or part of them and you can do in ActiveAhead overlapping grouping. So one node can belong to multiple groups, which is pretty handy in these kind of circumstances. But also then another option is to do kind of sparsely grouped luminaires. So if you group a luminaire, the neighbors do not need to belong to that group. And that makes it rather handy actually, that you can then use these kind of groups that are a bit here and there to lit up the whole big space of a parking garage type. And then when you enter the garage, we can, for example, use corridor hold kind of between those groups then that trigger the garage to lit up in the wanted area. And by the way, Josh or Thomas, let me know if Thomas then comes in, so I'll otherwise just continue. To a bit kind of, let's say, recap the setup efficiency benefits as such. So as said, there is little downtime typically required in a renovation case when you do it with ActiveAhead. So no wiring whatsoever as such needed. You don't need to think about how you zone them, how you run cables so that they are actually zoned or grouped with that one. You can then group them freely, and they are all part of the same mesh network. So you don't need to divide the network into kind of multiple networks. You can just install your luminaires and put your wall panels, configure them, and that's it. You can freely choose how you group the luminaires if you need to group them. The configuration is super fast with a mobile app, as it should be nowadays, and it has this out of the box to a certain extent. I kind of still say that typically you still in projects you would do certain degree of configuration, and I'll go the next slides a bit examples through that kind of what that really means and where you see the benefits then when you use ActiveAhead. But in essence, what ActiveAhead and the predictive lighting with ActiveAhead really brings is that you have the right lighting at the right moment at the right place. So it learns how the space is utilized, and that gives you then, if I'm here, I'll have light around me instead of then needing to, for example, lit up the whole space by zoning these with sensors. Hope this is still clear to you as such. But here's kind of, let's say, take a couple of examples on how then this ActiveAhead self-learning really brings the benefits in a real project. So here is an example layout of an office. Let's say normal, typical nowadays, you would have this kind of space where you have a lot of open plan areas. You have corridors in between those areas, and then you have meeting rooms and smaller rooms. So, for example, looking at the open plan areas, typically you would group the whole space and make it turn on to kind of your occupied light level, be it then 100% for the sake of, let's say, example. So everything goes to 100% when you enter the space. No matter if there's one person there or 10 persons there, you are spending the same amount of energy on that whole space. That's, let's say, the typical scenario how I would operate it. Well, here are 3 examples how you can do the same thing with ActiveAhead. And of course, it's flexible, so you can have then even kind of more options, of course, but these are, let's say, 3 examples. If you take the top left-hand corner, where there's only daylight harvesting, that means that you could basically let the system learn. If the kind of areas are, let's say, small enough, like here, for example, the top right-hand corner and the middle section of the open plan, likely there is actually no need to even do any grouping or things on top of the actual self-learning. But you typically want them to do daylight harvesting, and that's enabled by default with ActiveAhead. So your luminaires will take advantage of the kind of sunlight there might be and save the energy by doing that. But if you then, let's say, need, for example, want to group the corridors so that they stay on as a group or they go on as a group, you can then, in that kind of bottom left hand example here, this one, if you can see my cursor here, there you can then group the corridors. And for example, you can set a low light level for the corridor, because then when you enter the corridor, the light would actually go to higher light level as you approach them. And that is by the self-learning, how they have learned to follow each other. So the whole corridor would be up to 20%. And if it's a long corridor, you wouldn't, as a user, know the difference if you look at the end of the corridor, that whether it's on 20, 40, 60, 80, or 100%. So And if you don't go that far, why would you lead up the whole corridor to that high light level? So just to burn the energy that no one actually requires. So this is something that we've done, for example, in many projects in Finland, actually. So this is a bit country dependent also, that how have they kind of learned maybe to utilize, and how have they learned to specify, and what is the culture that people want to operate the lighting with as such. So for security and safety reasons in Finland, quite a lot of the projects have the corridor lighting on. So they want to keep light on the corridor so that people can see then how to, for example, exit the space. Then on that kind of bottom right hand corner, you would do grouping on these open plan areas. Similarly as with the corridors, you can actually have a lower light level for the grouping. So the group as such, when you enter the corner of that group, the whole group would go to 20%, but where you are, the sensors that actually see you and the nodes that see you, they would go on to their occupied light level and would stay there as long as you are present in that space. And then the other luminaires and nodes around them who have learned to follow those luminaires that see you and feel you present, then they would be holding them on a higher light level than that 20%. This resulting to have kind of more light where you actually are working in this case. So you would have the right lighting around you, and you would still see throughout the space thanks to the grouping functionality, but the group could be on a lower light level to save that extra energy there. And if you then want, you can then also have corridors holds here. So for example, the corridors can follow you can set them to follow the open plan areas that they are designed on. So that's how you can then operate and basically do then the extent of kind of configuration you want and feel kind of that is required based on the space needs as such. Then an example on a meeting room example. So on the left hand side, they are done kind of with active ahead, inbuilt luminaires active ahead. So let's say the standard way of active ahead, each luminaire having a radio node as well as then a sensor to detect the kind of presence of a person. And you can have a wall panel then to have the scenes for that meeting room. So if you want and need a presentation mode like in this room, you most likely would need, you can have a wall panel there, a wireless one, to actually control and turn on those scenes. But now in the second generation of Active Ahead, you can do that with the Node DALI Advanced product, which can then and offers you scenes within that one local DALI subnet. So it has a built-in DALI power supply that actually can then connect these luminaires around it to it. So these would be DALI luminaires in this example. And you can also use then our Helvar DALI system sensors. For example, in this case, 321 you could use. And if the space is kind of that big that you actually need multiple sensors, then you can add another sensor to that DALI bus there, so that you actually really are covering the whole space. And this Node DALI Advanced in spaces like this, it's actually really handy, because then you might have then these kind of, let's say, a bit particular design luminaires or whatever. So then you can just freely choose your DALI luminaires and connect them locally within that room to that Node DALI Advanced, and then add your panel. And you can still do all of that grouping and corridor holds kind of using that node. So that Node DALI Advanced, even though having then multiple luminaires in certain cases behind it, you can still group it on active ahead mesh level, so with the other nodes and so forth. So that's kind of flexible from hardware setup perspective as well. So not just that the configuration is flexible, but also the hardware selection is flexible for you. And with that product, you can use DALI relays and so forth, and to have your a bit more special use cases made possible. And final thing for just to highlight also that these we have for the personalized needs, for example, a thing called Active Tune, which is sticker you can put on the desk, and a space user can scan with their mobile phone that QR code on the sticker and use our Active Tune mobile, really simple mobile application then to tune and control the light above their desk, or it can be a few lights around that desk if it is many. So, and that's something we have received really positive feedback on and used in multiple projects already. And by the way, for example, for these well certificates and others, you'll get extra points when you utilize and offer the personalized control capabilities for the space user. So not needing to put a wireless wall panel on the desk, every desk, you can actually use these simpler tools and maybe more user-friendly tools then to kind of offer the same experience. And as said, the energy savings are kind of as high as they can be, basically, with a solution like ActiveAhead, where you have a lot of sensors to cover the space, so you exactly know where the people are in the space, and such you can then turn or dim down the luminaires around that area. And where there is no one, you don't need to have any lights on, if you don't need them. Where you actually can then utilize ActiveAhead in projects, what kind of types of spaces we typically see with ActiveAhead is that the office space has been the, let's say, #1 application area. And of course, in offices, you have stairways, corridors, such spaces where you then can really take advantage of the self-learning. So you don't need to lit up the whole stairway from the kind of ground floor to the highest floor. Instead, it offers you then the right lighting where the persons actually are utilizing the stairs. The same case with corridors. We actually then have done a lot of parking garages, like I mentioned, our own garage here, but also a lot of other garages, and it's really good fit for such spaces where you are then having people kind of using the space, and it's not occupied all the time typically. So in offices, of course, during the day, if there's a lot of people there, any kind of light in that space would be on, and so you are actually getting benefits on the more silent times and on certain corridors and such spaces with ActiveAhead. But in a garage case, like I showed you the energy saving numbers, that's extreme savings you can have in such space, where the kind of the space utilization is such that people drive their car in and they'll go to the elevator or stairway to go to their own floor, and then they come back and drive away. So actually lighting up the whole space all the time doesn't typically make any sense. Warehouse is something we've started to do recently, and that is thanks to the kind of DALI support we have now, and the DALI sensor support more importantly, so that we can actually have high bay sensors. The Helvar 322 system sensor for the high bay is a good fit to be used in such high bay kind of premises. But you get the similar benefits by freely kind of grouping them and having just the areas which are at the moment utilized being lit up. Couple of reference cases to go through. Why especially for the renovation case and example project, this is a really good example how ActiveAhead brings the benefits for the kind of tenant and the space user. So they wanted to have a flexible future-proof solution that can offer them kind of right lighting levels and also this personalized control, because they actually wanted to have REAM points from the lighting as well, and they got them by utilizing Active Tune on those kind of workstations. So there's a lot of actually Active Tune configured to work on those workstation areas. But they have done now 2 buildings with ActiveAhead in their headquarters. The first one they did was kind of, let's say, a bit more thorough renovation, where they also moved or removed walls to make open plan areas and such. And the second phase was then that they wanted to do and kind of refurbish the building that was connected to the first building. And that was actually requested by the space users on that other building. So when they saw that nice lighting on the first building that we did, they wanted to have the same on the second building. And the second building had otherwise been renovated already earlier, so they actually only swapped the luminaires one-to-one with the existing ones, and they had zero downtime basically for that space. So they had an area for the workforce to go when their room or area was under renovation, but what they saw was that people went for lunch or coffee, and when they turned back, their space or their working area had been already renovated, and they were actually able to continue working immediately after the break. So they got really good benefits out of the Active Ahead. These room areas, they didn't need to actually configure at all. So they only grouped the corridors on the second building as such. And the customers have been really happy with it. An example of a new building, so not just to say that Active Ahead is a really good fit for the renovation, but it of course is for new building alike. So Ramboll headquarters has roughly 3,000 Active Ahead nodes in it, inbuilt to the luminaires you see in these pictures here. One part of the building is a parking garage, so there's also a garage, which is kind of there are 4 segments, or how do you call, towers in that building, and one of them is the parking garage. But all the office areas are done with Active Ahead, and actually very little configuration there as well. But they are also not just utilizing the lighting that Active Ahead brings, but also actually they are interested in especially the occupancy data of that building. So we have connected that to Helvar Cloud and offer then the data for them to kind of utilize and see how their space is used. We have a lot of sensors. And this is also an example where we have a hybrid building. So there is also a segment done with Helvar Imagine router system. So, and that is something, of course, special, that Active Ahead can be then extended with router in these kind of buildings, where in the areas where you need then, let's say, more control and more logic there that doesn't make sense with a wireless system. So then we do have in our offering Imagine router system then for those type of spaces. So for those who have been in kind of, let's say, using Active Ahead, the current generation, now what is more in the second generation that is now coming out is that yes, the hardware has been renewed. So we are utilizing the latest and greatest chipsets and so that we have more memory, better antenna performance and whatnot. We've improved the installability, for example, the kind of product in this picture, the Node DALI Advanced. It's super simple now to install even with thick wires. So in the past, you may have kind of noted that it can be tricky to install it, but now we've really taken in the feedback we've had with the current generation of the products and then renewed the hardware to kind of tick the boxes that we've had as a feedback from the customers. New features, some of them mentioned already, but there are kind of a growing number of things we are being capable of adding to the solution, now that we have more memory and more processing power in it as such. So really interesting future ahead of us with Active Ahead as such. As you saw, and I already said, for example, Ramboll has been connected already to Helvar Cloud system, and now we are, let's say, more kind of properly launching that for Active Ahead. So far we've done projects, but we haven't yet kind of been promoting it to a large extent. But now we start to do that as well. So you'll get the monitoring and maintenance services, the occupancy, the energy consumption, so forth with Active Ahead, and if you need them. And again, Active Ahead works as a kind of a system on its own when you first turn the power on. So all of these things actually you can add on it and you can sell to the customers as they need them. So it's an adaptive system, a flexible system that you can then upgrade also in the future. So you don't need to necessarily install new systems or tear down the products and replace the products. You are then being able to take the, let's say, wireless wall panel, simple example. You can just bring it to the space, connect it with the luminaires, and offer your clients then the additional features they may need in their spaces. And to recap, what is Active Ahead, why it is such a great system that we believe, and based on the feedback received, we've seen it to be, is that the installation, of course, that is effortless. So both, not just that you just plug in the power, but it actually starts working immediately. You'll have the self-learning benefits, and not just the energy consumption kind of reduced, but you also have then the comfort aspect and so forth with that self-learning. And having such a lot of sensors in the space, we are generating a lot of data, and we can then build insights on top of that data that we get. So, and Bluetooth mesh as such, not to mention that as the last thing, but it's of course kind of built for carrying data. So it is a system that from which we can also assume that we can get data going forward as well. So it won't stop here. We will kind of continue to pursue the opportunities we can see with Active Ahead. But with that, want to thank you. Unfortunately, now Thomas was not able to join me after all. It was all looking fine 5 minutes before the call, but I don't know if he stumbled on the core or what did he do. Hopefully he is okay still. So
yes, I think he's fine, but unfortunately some technical difficulties today, Matti.
No worries. Luckily, I know the stuff as such, so we went through with Thomas what was he kind of going to say. But hopefully next time we'll then have another person also. So there are no more webinars planned, and where I won't hopefully be then talking alone.
Yes, and we appreciate you going through those slides on behalf of Thomas. So at this point, Matti, we'll move over to some questions, and there have been some good ones coming in already, which I've got in the question box just on this screen over to my left. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask, and we'll start going through them, as many as we can in the time allowed. The first question I thought was really interesting, given the current circumstances that we're going through. So as with our office or offices, Matti, they're pretty much unoccupied for the most part at the moment because of the current situation. How does Active Ahead cope with that? Does it suddenly see basically no people and then kind of have to adapt, or does it understand that there's something different going on? What's the way it works?
Thanks. That's yes, it's really relevant question at the moment, unfortunately, indeed. So how the system function is that it basically pauses the learning when the space is not utilized. So if there is no one, or if you turn on kind of off even the mains, the nodes we have will preserve their learning. So whatever they've learned when there were still people utilizing the space, it will kind of preserve those. So it won't throw them away while the space is now not being used. Typically in these kind of cases, you would still have the power as such, but even though you would cut the power and just say that, hey, this space will be off for 2 months in this case, it would still continue from where it left when it kind of the power is turned off, or when the people enter again the office. So with Active Ahead, that's not a problem. So the self-learning does continue to be there, and it's basically learning when there is space usage. So it won't turn it off and suddenly say that, hey, I don't want to learn to follow anyone here because there is no kind of utilization in this space. It will wait till there is. And the same would be, for example, if you would have a rental space and then you have new occupants coming in, so there might be a break in the system. But typically, if the space is roughly the same, it will continue to be roughly the same. And if it is different, actually, then it will adapt over time to that one. So in Active Ahead, we continuously learn, we continuously adapt. It never will stop learning as such.
Okay, so it's like a little bit like it's in kind of hibernation almost, if there's nobody around for a while, like if it's summer holidays, or maybe COVID-19 proof we should put on the spec sheet.
Yes.
Another question coming in here. Let me just look at the monitor. So a good one here from Colin. Hello, Colin. If Active Ahead starts learning from the point it's switched on, whilst when the project is being installed, is the process restarted at handover point to the end user? good question.
Yes, indeed. Excellent question as such. So you are having a good point there, because actually the algorithm does have a faster learning in the beginning, and that is exactly for the reason that when you then come in, it kind of fast will kind of learn roughly how that space is utilized, and then it will kind of slow slightly down, because we don't want then the system to change daily as such. So then if you are doing some changes, they typically kind of, we want there to be evidence that there is actual space usage changes. But in most cases, actually, assuming, let's say, that you set in the lighting to a project and there's no furniture, for example, there. So the only people actually working there and moving there around would be the kind of workforce who actually are still building that premises, or will bring in the furniture as such. So yes, the system will learn how those guys are going to utilizing the space, but in most cases, it is still rather similar then to the eventual use. So whatever learning that the system does during that period would be actually beneficial when the actual tenant moves in. But you can also at the handover stage actually reset the learning. So you can do the factory reset for the learning through the mobile app if you want to. So if the customer wants that it will start from scratch when they move in, that is possible to do in ActiveAhead.
Okay, good. And I hope that answers your question, Colin, but if not, please do let us know. Let's have a look at a few of the other questions that come in. Somebody is disappointed that you're not wearing your red jacket today for presenting, and I'm also disappointed, I must admit, but we'll leave that one there. We've got a few questions coming in from Simon. So hello, Simon. So maybe multiple questions. So asking, how do you monitor the occupancy data? What's the update time for the data as well? So how often are we polling the system for that? And can we offer emergency lighting and emergency lighting test and report as well? So a three-barreled question there. So maybe you can take them in turn.
Good. And yes, I wanted to show that I have other jackets than red ones, even though it's completely color. So occupancy data, actually the benefit with ActiveAhead is that we are actually, and that's thanks to the BLE mesh we're working on top of, is that we can actually send quite a lot of data on top of it. So whereas in the traditional, let's say wired systems especially, or the traditional, even some of the wireless ones, you are sending only kind of presence information every now and then. So let's say every 30 seconds, even though I'm continuously present here. In ActiveAhead, we're actually sending it far more often. So we want to know in rather detail how the space is utilized, kind of where do we have people at the moment and so forth. So we are sharing that data more frequently, and also then that is taken into the Helvar cloud system if that is connected. So yes, we get the raw data there as well, but basically we offer out then the insight of based on that data to the customer as such. Then the second question, what was it now again? It was about the other frequency of the data, I believe, or
yeah,
how often
we update.
Yeah, so that depends now a bit on the data type. So if we are kind of thinking about the data services on the cloud side, so what kind of data points we offer. So as said, for example, the occupancy data is something we get a lot of information from the nodes. So where are they, how kind of what state they are in at the moment, how are they actually seeing the presence of the people and so forth. So that we are offering and basically pushing to the cloud. It's more that way, so we don't need to poll. The nodes are actively kind of publishing what they hear and see around them. But then there are certain other things like, let's say, energy consumption. So as we are reading that from the drivers, where they actually are then having that raw data, so to say. So we don't want to pull that or push that to the cloud all the time. So that's then something now in the beginning we take hourly, but it's a range. Let's say the rhythm is something we can change as well. So it's something that we see most typically being enough, but there may be customers who want it more frequently, or maybe who want to actually pull it on a certain period of time. So we look into those as well as we go forward. And based on the customer needs and real use cases, we'll then adapt the APIs also and the data points based on those requirements. But mostly we'll see that the energy, for example, most customers want to have a report on it that, hey, monthly or whatever. So for that, of course, hourly is more than fine. But as I said, it depends on the data type. The third question was about the emergency lighting support.
Yep.
So when can we actually kind of do scheduling and reporting? That is at the moment on the backlog for us, and we aim to do that, but it's not yet available with ActiveAhead. But that is on the backlog, so to say. But no kind of, let's say, deadline yet for it, or let's say target date that we can share with you, unfortunately. But it's certainly something that, and we know that, for example, UK market is keen on having. So definitely on the list, quite actually high on the list, so to say.
Good, and I think it's good to know that there's lots of kind of continued development planned, and it's an ongoing process for us to make these products into the best products and solutions they can be in the market, taking on board feedback like we've just had. So keep in touch, Simon, and hopefully at some point in the future we can talk to you again. Another good question here from Jerry. So hello, Jerry. What are the restrictions for the installation of sensors? Talking about drywalls, metalwork, etc. Can the sensor operate for more than a single group? So I guess the first question looks at different aspects. So whether it's a standalone kind of sensor or a system sensor, shall we say, in the ceiling versus the ActiveAhead sensor in the luminaire, and then the grouping part is maybe part two of that question.
Yes. So if I take the grouping, if I understood well, the grouping as such, as said earlier, each node in ActiveAhead. So assume you have now a node in which you have connected the sensor. You can group that node freely with other nodes in the system. So in, let's say, the most common case where you would use such a grouping, that you have, let's assume a case where you have luminaires without sensors, as an example. So that would be typically high bay installations where it's too high for the luminaire-based sensor to actually detect anyone below, let's say, 12 meters. So in that case, we would have nodes with the high bay sensor in them. And yes, you can now then freely group whichever luminaires you want with that one. And you can also have multiple groups. So say you would have a cross section in your space, and the node sensor would be in that cross section, then you can have a different group for different areas if you want to. And then you can have multiple sensors per those groups and so forth. So it's really actually flexible in that grouping way. So you don't need to have just one node and a sensor and think that, okay, this sensor can only be in one group. That's actually something which is a difference to many of the other systems where you typically can have one sensor in one group. Here you can have one sensor in multiple groups, and those groups can also overlap, and as said earlier, also can be such that they are a bit here and there, so you don't need to group a certain area kind of neighbors, but you can, it's really kind of up to you how you want to group them based on the space needs and requirements.
Okay.
Was there another question there regarding something?
There was. It was about the restriction for how you install the sensor, and I guess there's mentioned there's two elements to it: system sensor in a ceiling or the ActiveAhead sensor in a luminaire.
Yes. So if you start with the, let's say, luminaire-based sensor, so let's say in best case the sensor would have the same center of detection area as the light would have its center of light as such. But if it's a linear luminaire, typically the sensor would be at the far end of either end of the luminaire as such. So it depends, of course, on the luminaire design. But the key kind of idea, of course, that the sensor can detect and cover the area it is supposed to cover. So that it's pointing to the same space where the actual kind of movement is to be detected, so to say. With the system sensor, then, with the node DALI Advanced, as said, you can have and connect multiple sensors to the same node DALI Advanced. Let's say if you look at it from the system perspective, they then look as one sensor to the other nodes in the system. So if you have grouped this one node with multiple sensors together with other nodes, they would kind of any of those sensors being active would keep the whole group active that are then multiple nodes as such. So again, you can then, as it's DALI wire, then the system sensors, then you can run your DALI wire to wherever you then need to detect the presence as such. So the active ahead sensor that you can also use with this Node DALI Advanced, there you have then a certain selection and of different cable lengths. So the really small, tiny active ahead sensor we have for typically for the office spaces, it has kind of fixed cable in it, and that is then from 30 centimeters to 1.5 meters in the generation 2. So then you have a certain selection of different cable lengths that then kind of course, but that's because it is meant to be used either within the luminaire, or then if this Node DALI Advanced is used, for example, in a corridor space in between the, let's say, 4 luminaires, an example, typical example, then it would be quite close to the Node DALI Advanced product itself, in which case that cable length would be just fine. But in other cases, then with the system sensors, we can freely position them, because then you are running a DALI cable between the node and the system sensors.
Okay, and I think I'm right in saying that the active ahead sensor itself could be outside the luminaire in a particular holder that we supply, and then with the system sensors, of course, there are back boxes and other kind of fixing methods available. So hopefully covering most bases there. But if you have any further comments or questions on that, Jerry, please do get in touch if that hasn't answered your question. Another probably final question, I think, based on time, that's come in from Thomas, not our Thomas, but a different one. Because Thomas can't communicate with us at the moment, is about the integration possibilities. So you mentioned a little bit about integration with the Ramboll example, but is that something that you're getting more requests for, and how do you see that progressing in future as more people are looking into these total building systems?
Sure. So yes, integration is, I'd say, coming up more often. So even though, let's say, in renovation cases, it doesn't typically come up that often. So people are having, certain of the other systems are so old that there's actually no kind of ways even to integrate. But if you're then having a bit more, let's say, future-driven building, then most often they want to actually integrate on the cloud level, which we, for example, Ramboll has done, and that's possible now through the cloud services. Local integrations, what we have as of today, you can use relays kind of either way as such, for example. So an example from one of the generation 2 sites now, that where they have a shop that is kind of, whenever it's open, there is a relay keeping the Node DALI Advanced product, kind of keeping them through that selected groups active, for example. So that kind of local integrations are possible, and of course that's the simplest way how you can easily integrate between systems, is to use this kind of, let's say, switch input or relay input as such. But for then we are continuously looking at the other integrations then, and you should stay tuned for then those to kind of be announced then later on. But now we are focused on getting this as a package first now, or out to the market, and then, as said earlier, we are continuing to develop this further, and we see great opportunities around this whole active ahead as such.
Good, glad to hear it. Okay, I think that looks like every question that we've had come in for today. So that's it for today's webinar. Huge thank you to Matti for the informative presentation. Our apologies to Thomas that he couldn't join today, but hopefully in the future. Another great big thank you to all of you for taking your time out of the diary today to join us. Don't forget to keep an eye on our webinars page, which will give you updates on the next instalments that we've got coming up, and we'll try and keep these pretty regular, so there's always something to have a look at and learn about. If you have any further questions, do feel free to get in touch with us using the marketing@helvar.com email address, or contact your local Helvar sales representative. But for now, wishing you all a productive day. Please stay safe out there. So goodbye from Matti.
Thank you. Goodbye and stay safe.
And goodbye from me. Goodbye, everybody. Take care.